The blood on Laura Kensington's hands wouldn't wash off no matter how hard she scrubbed them in the cold creek water, though perhaps that was because it wasn't really there anymore, just a memory that haunted her as she stumbled through the darkness of the Colorado wilderness in 1878. She had been running for 3 days now, ever since she witnessed her uncle murder his business partner in cold blood, and then turn those murderous eyes toward her, realizing she had seen everything through the study window. Her parents had died from fever the previous winter, leaving her in the care of this monster who now wanted her silenced forever. The pine trees seemed to close in around her as dawn broke over the mountains, and Laura could barely feel her feet anymore in the thin leather shoes that were meant for parlor floors, not rocky terrain. Her dress was torn in several places, her dark hair had come completely loose from its pins, and she knew she must look like some wild creature herself. She had no money, no food, and no idea where she was going except away from Denver and the man who wanted her dead. When she finally collapsed near a small stream, her body simply gave out. She lay there on the damp ground, wondering if this was how her story would end at just 19 years old, alone in the wilderness with no one who even knew she was missing or cared enough to look. Her uncle would have already spun some tale about her running off or meeting with an unfortunate accident, and society would believe him because he was respectable and wealthy, and she was just an orphaned girl with no voice of her own. The sound of hoofbeats made her freeze, every muscle in her body tensing with terror. Had he found her? Had he sent someone after her? She tried to make herself smaller behind the fallen log where she had collapsed, but she was too weak to run anymore even if she wanted to. "Easy there, boy," a man's voice said, and it was directed at a horse, not at her. "What are you getting fussed about?" Laura held her breath, pressing herself against the rough bark of the log. Through a gap in the wood, she could see a rider, a cowboy from the look of him, sitting astride a paint horse that was tossing its head and looking directly toward her hiding spot. "Something's got you spooked," the man continued, and then he dismounted with an easy grace. He was tall, she could see that much, with dark hair under a worn hat and a leather vest over a work shirt. He moved toward her position, and Laura knew she had been discovered. She tried to scramble to her feet, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. She managed to push herself up against the log, raising her hands in a defensive gesture even though she had no strength to fight. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse from lack of water. "Please don't hurt me." The cowboy stopped immediately, his hands moving away from his sides in a gesture of peace. Now that he was closer, she could see his face more clearly. He looked to be in his mid-20s, with strong features and dark eyes that held surprise and concern rather than the malice she had feared. "Madam, I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice gentle. "You look like you've been through hell and back. Are you injured?" Laura wanted to answer, wanted to explain, but suddenly the world tilted and darkness swept over her like a wave. When consciousness returned, she was no longer on the cold ground. She was moving, she realized, cradled against something warm and solid. The rhythmic movement of a horse registered in her awareness, and she tensed. "Easy now," that same gentle voice said. "You're safe. I'm taking you somewhere you can get help." Laura's eyes fluttered open, and she found herself held securely in the cowboy's arms as he rode, his coat wrapped around her shoulders. She knew she should be afraid, should be protesting, but something in his steady presence made her feel, for the first time in days, that perhaps she wasn't going to die out here alone. "Who are you?" she managed to ask. "Name's Xavier Irving," he replied, glancing down at her. "I work at a ranch about 5 miles from here. What's your name, and what in God's name are you doing out here alone?" "Laura," she said, then hesitated. She couldn't tell him everything, couldn't risk word getting back to her uncle. Laura Kensington. I was traveling and got separated from my party. Even in her weakened state, she could see the skepticism in his expression, but he didn't challenge her obvious lie. Well, Miss Kensington, right now we need to get you warm and fed. The rest can wait. True to his word, Xavier didn't press her for details as they rode. Laura drifted in and out of awareness, each time finding herself still held safely in his arms. The sun was higher in the sky when they finally arrived at what appeared to be a modest ranch, with a main house, a barn, and several outbuildings scattered across a valley between the mountains. An older woman came out onto the porch as they approached, wiping her hands on her apron. "Xavier Irving, what have you found now?" she called out, but her tone was more concerned than critical. "She needs help, Mrs. Patterson," Xavier said, carefully dismounting while still holding Laura. "Found her collapsed by Miller's Creek." Mrs. Patterson hurried down the steps, her weathered face full of maternal concern as she got a good look at Laura. "Bring her inside quickly now. She looks half-starved and frozen to boot." The next few hours passed in a blur of warmth and kindness that Laura had almost forgotten existed. Mrs. Patterson, who turned out to be the housekeeper and cook for the ranch, helped her out of her ruined dress and into a warm bath, clucking over the cuts and bruises on her feet and the scratches on her arms from branches. She provided Laura with a simple but clean dress and insisted she eat some bread and broth, even though Laura's stomach had shrunk so much that she could barely manage a few bites. "That's enough for now," Mrs. Patterson said, patting Laura's hand. "You'll make yourself sick if you eat too much too fast. You rest here and we'll get more food in you later." Laura was installed in a small bedroom that was clean and simple, with a quilt on the bed and curtains at the window. As Mrs. Patterson left her to rest, Laura finally let herself relax enough to take in her situation. She was safe, at least for the moment. But she couldn't stay here, couldn't bring danger to these people who had shown her such kindness. Her uncle had connections throughout Colorado, and if he was looking for her, he would eventually search every ranch and farm in the territory. Despite her worries, exhaustion claimed her, and she fell into a deep sleep. When she woke, the light outside had changed to the golden hue of late afternoon. There was a pitcher of water and a glass on the table beside the bed, and Laura drank deeply, soothing her parched throat. As she set the glass down, there was a soft knock at the door. "Miss Kensington." "Are you awake?" It was Xavier's voice. "Yes," Laura called out, pulling the quilt around her shoulders as she sat up. Xavier entered, hat in hand, looking almost uncomfortable in the domestic setting. He was taller than she had realized, probably over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that spoke of years of hard work. His dark hair was slightly wavy where it curled at his collar, and his eyes were a warm brown that seemed kind despite the serious expression on his face. "How are you feeling?" he asked, staying near the door as if aware that his presence in her bedroom was improper, even under these circumstances. "Much better, thank you," Laura said. "I cannot thank you enough for your help, Mr. Irving. You saved my life." "Xavier is fine," he said, "and you don't need to thank me." "Anyone would have done the same." He paused, turning his hat in his hands. "Miss Kensington, I don't want to press you, but are you in some kind of trouble? You weren't traveling with any party, were you?" Laura's throat tightened. She wanted to trust him, wanted to tell him everything, but fear held her tongue. "I appreciate your concern, but I cannot involve you in my affairs. I will leave tomorrow and trouble you no further." "Leave to go where?" Xavier asked, his tone gentle but persistent. "You have no supplies, no horse, and forgive me for being blunt, but you look like you've been running from something that terrified you. If someone is after you, going out there alone isn't going to help." Tears stung Laura's eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. "I have nowhere to go," she admitted, her voice breaking, "and no one to trust, but that does not mean I should endanger you and Mrs. Patterson by staying here." Xavier was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Then he moved further into the room, though he maintained a respectful distance, and sat down in the chair by the window. "Why don't you tell me what happened? Maybe I can help." "You cannot help with this," Laura said. "The man who wants to harm me is powerful and connected. He will not stop looking for me." "Try me," Xavier said simply. Perhaps it was the gentleness in his voice, or perhaps it was the fact that she was so tired of being afraid and alone, but Laura found herself telling him everything. She told him about her parents' death, about going to live with her uncle in Denver, about what she had witnessed through the study window that terrible night. She told him about running, about the 3 days of terror and exhaustion, about knowing that if her uncle found her, she would never be heard from again. Xavier listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as the story unfolded. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight. "Your uncle is Richard Kensington," he said finally. "It wasn't a question. I've heard of him. He's been buying up mining interests all over Colorado." "You see why I have to leave," Laura said. "If he traces me here, if he learns you helped me." "Then we'll deal with it," Xavier said firmly. "But you're not going back out there alone, and that's final." He stood up, settling his hat back on his head. "This ranch belongs to my father and my 2 older brothers. They're good men, and they'll agree that you're welcome to stay here as long as you need. You can help Mrs. Patterson with the housework if it makes you feel better about accepting our hospitality, but you're staying." "Why?" Laura asked, bewildered by his certainty. "Why would you risk so much for a stranger?" Xavier paused at the door, looking back at her. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because I've seen what happens when good people look the other way from injustice. I won't be one of those people." He tipped his hat to her. "Get some more rest. We'll figure out the details tomorrow." After he left, Laura sat in the gathering darkness, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was fragile and frightening, but it was there, kindled by a cowboy's unexpected kindness. The next morning, Laura woke to the smell of bacon and coffee. Her body still ached, but the deep exhaustion had lifted somewhat. She dressed carefully in the borrowed dress and braided her hair, then made her way to the kitchen where Mrs. Patterson was working at the stove. "There you are, dear," the older woman said with a warm smile. "Sit yourself down and have some breakfast. You need to get your strength back." As Laura sat at the large wooden table, the back door opened and several men filed in, bringing the smell of hay and leather with them. She recognized Xavier immediately, and the family resemblance in the other men was clear. "Miss Kensington, I'd like you to meet my father, James Irving, and my brothers, Thomas and Robert," Xavier said, gesturing to each man in turn. James Irving was a broad man in his 50s with graying hair and a weathered face that spoke of decades of outdoor work. Thomas and Robert were both taller than Xavier and looked to be in their late 20s and early 30s respectively. All 3 regarded her with friendly curiosity. "Xavier told us about your situation," James said, his voice deep and kind. "You're welcome here for as long as you need, Miss Kensington. We don't hold with men who threaten women, powerful or not." "Thank you, Mr. Irving," Laura said, overwhelmed by their acceptance. "I don't know how to repay such kindness." "No need for repayment," James said, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "Though if you're staying, you'll earn your keep like everyone else here. Mrs. Patterson could use help with the house, and we could use another hand in the garden come spring." "Fair enough." "More than fair," Laura agreed, feeling the tightness in her chest ease slightly. Over breakfast, she learned that the Irving ranch raised cattle and horses, and that they employed several other ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse. The family had been in Colorado for 15 years, building their ranch from nothing into a successful operation. They were honest, hardworking people, and Laura felt safer among them than she had anywhere since her parents died. After the meal, Xavier found her on the porch, looking out at the mountains that ringed the valley. "Want to see the ranch?" he asked. Laura accepted, and they walked together in the crisp morning air. Xavier showed her the barn where they kept the horses, the chicken coop, the smokehouse, and the various other buildings that made the ranch function. He introduced her to the ranch hands, who all touched their hats respectfully and went back to their work. "It's beautiful here," Laura said as they stood looking out over a pasture where horses grazed peacefully. "So peaceful. It can be," Xavier agreed. "Though ranching is hard work and there are always challenges, but I love it. This land, this life, it's all I've ever wanted." "You're lucky to know what you want," Laura said. "I never had that chance. My parents wanted me to marry well, to be a proper lady in society. I learned embroidery and piano and how to manage servants, but I never learned anything useful." "You're learning now," Xavier said, glancing at her with a slight smile. "And for what it's worth, I think there's more to you than embroidery and piano." Over the following weeks, Laura settled into life at the ranch. She worked alongside Mrs. Patterson, learning how to cook and preserve food, how to do laundry in the big tubs behind the house, how to mend clothes and tend the kitchen garden. The work was harder than anything she had ever done, and her hands developed calluses and her back ached at the end of each day, but she found satisfaction in the honest labor. Xavier was often nearby, taking his meals at the house and finding reasons to check in on various tasks that brought him close to where she was working. They fell into an easy companionship, talking while they worked or during the evenings when the family gathered in the main room. Laura found herself looking forward to these conversations, to the way Xavier listened carefully to everything she said and shared his own thoughts with equal openness. "Tell me about Denver," he said one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sun set behind the mountains. "What was your life like before?" Laura was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "It was like living in a cage made of silk," she said finally. "Everything was proper and scheduled. We had calling hours and tea parties and balls. I was supposed to smile and be charming and never have an opinion of my own. After my parents died, it got worse. My uncle was only interested in marrying me off to whoever would bring him the best business connections." "That sounds lonely," Xavier observed. "It was," Laura admitted. "I used to look out my window at night and watch the stars and wonder if there was more to life than what I was living. I wanted adventure, wanted to matter somehow. Be careful what you wish for, I suppose." Xavier shook his head. "What happened to you wasn't adventure, it was injustice." "But you survived it. That takes courage." "I was just afraid," Laura said. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," Xavier said. "It's doing what you have to do despite the fear. You ran when you needed to run. You kept yourself alive. That's courage." Laura looked at him in the fading light, at the strong lines of his face and the genuine warmth in his eyes, and felt something shift in her chest. Xavier Irving was unlike any man she had ever known. He was honest and kind, hardworking and thoughtful. He treated her like an equal, valued her opinions, and never made her feel less than whole despite her circumstances. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." "You don't need to keep thanking me," Xavier said, but his smile was gentle. "I'm glad you're here, Laura. I'm glad you're safe." As winter deepened, the ranch settled into its cold weather routine. There was less outdoor work to be done, but the animals still needed tending, and there were always fences to mend and equipment to repair. Laura spent more time indoors, and Xavier found more reasons to be in the house, helping with tasks or just sitting by the fire in the evenings. They talked about everything. Xavier told her about growing up on the ranch, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about the hard years when drought or harsh winters nearly broke the family. Laura told him about her childhood before her parents died, about the books she loved to read and the dreams she used to have. "I always wanted to see the ocean," she confessed one snowy afternoon as they worked together carding wool that would be spun into yarn. "I used to imagine standing on a beach and looking out at all that water, wondering what was beyond the horizon." "Maybe someday you will," Xavier said. "Maybe," Laura said, but she couldn't quite imagine a future that clear anymore. Her life was bounded by the fear of discovery, by the knowledge that her uncle was still out there and still looking for her. She had been at the ranch for 2 months now, and every day she expected someone to arrive and shatter the fragile peace she had found. One morning in late January, that fear nearly became reality. Laura was in the kitchen with Mrs. Patterson when they heard horses approaching. Through the window, she saw 3 men she didn't recognize riding into the yard, and her heart seized with terror. "Mrs. Patterson," she whispered urgently. "I need to hide." The older woman took one look at Laura's face and immediately grasped the situation. "Upstairs, in my room, there's a chest at the foot of the bed. Get behind it and stay quiet." Laura rushed upstairs, her heart pounding. From Mrs. Patterson's room, she could hear voices below, could hear Xavier and his father talking to the strangers. She pressed herself behind the chest, making herself as small as possible, and prayed they weren't here for her. The conversation below seemed to last forever. Finally, she heard the horses leave, and a few minutes later Xavier's footsteps on the stairs. "Laura, they're gone. It's safe." She emerged from her hiding place, her hands shaking. "Were they looking for me?" "No," Xavier said, but his expression was serious. "They were buyers from down south looking at horses." "But Laura, we need to talk about this. You can't live your whole life afraid every time someone rides up to the ranch." "What choice do I have?" Laura asked, feeling the fear and frustration of the past months finally spilling over. "He's never going to stop looking for me, Xavier. Richard Kensington doesn't leave loose ends. Eventually, someone is going to connect me to this ranch, and then what? I've put you all in danger just by being here." "Then we'll deal with it when it happens," Xavier said firmly. He crossed the room and took her hands in his touch warm and steady. "Laura, listen to me. You're not alone anymore. You have people who care about you, who will stand with you. You don't have to face this by yourself." Laura looked up at him, at the certainty in his eyes, and felt something break open inside her. She had been holding herself together through sheer will for so long, and suddenly she couldn't do it anymore. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and Xavier pulled her into his arms without hesitation, holding her as she finally let herself cry for everything she had lost and everything she was afraid of losing. "I'm sorry," she said when she could finally speak again, her face pressed against his chest. "I'm sorry for bringing this to your door, for being such a burden." "You're not a burden," Xavier said, his voice rough with emotion. "Laura, you could never be a burden to me." He pulled back just enough to look down at her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "I care about you. More than I probably should, more than I know how to say properly. But I need you to know that I'm not going to let anything happen to you. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Laura's breath caught at the intensity in his eyes, at the unspoken meaning in his words. She had known for weeks now that her feelings for Xavier had grown into something deeper than friendship. But she had been afraid to acknowledge it, afraid to want something that seemed impossible given her circumstances. "Xavier," she whispered, and then his lips were on hers, gentle and questioning. Laura answered by rising on her toes and kissing him back, pouring all of her fear and hope and growing love into that connection. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. Xavier rested his forehead against hers, his hands cradling her face. "I'm in love with you, Laura Kensington," he said simply. "I know the timing is terrible and your life is complicated, but I needed you to know that." "I love you too," Laura said, the words feeling both frightening and freeing. "I think I have for weeks now. But Xavier, how can we possibly make this work? I'm being hunted by a murderer. I have nothing to offer you except danger." "You offer me everything that matters," Xavier said. "Your courage, your kindness, your quick mind, and your beautiful heart. That's more than enough." He kissed her forehead gently. "We'll find a way, Laura. I promise you we'll find a way." In the weeks that followed, Laura and Xavier's relationship deepened. They were careful to maintain propriety under his father's roof, but there was no hiding the way they felt about each other. Mrs. Patterson smiled knowingly when she saw them together, and Xavier's brothers teased him good-naturedly about being sweet on the city girl. "She's good for you," Thomas said one day as they worked together repairing a section of fence. "Haven't seen you this happy in years." "She's everything," Xavier admitted. "Tom, if I asked her to marry me, would that be crazy, given everything she's dealing with?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, hammering in a nail before he answered. "Seems to me that given everything she's dealing with, having someone who loves her and wants to build a life with her might be exactly what she needs. But that's a question only you and she can answer." Xavier thought about it for days. He wanted to marry Laura, wanted to make her his wife and spend the rest of his life with her. But was it fair to ask her when her situation was so uncertain? Would she think he was trying to trap her into something out of obligation? Finally, he decided that honesty was the only way forward. He asked Laura to ride out with him one afternoon in early March when the weather had started to warm, and the first signs of spring were appearing. They rode to a high meadow that overlooked the valley, where wildflowers were just beginning to push through the remaining snow. "This is beautiful," Laura said, dismounting and walking to the edge of the meadow. "I can see the whole world from here." Xavier joined her, his heart hammering in his chest. "Laura, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." She turned to look at him, concern flickering across her face. "What is it?" "I want to marry you," Xavier said, the words coming out in a rush. "I know your situation is complicated, and I know we haven't known each other very long by some measures, but I am absolutely certain that I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to build a home with you and face whatever comes together, but I need to know if that's something you want too, or if you feel obligated because I helped you." Laura's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "You think I feel obligated?" she asked. "Xavier, you're the first person in my life who's ever made me feel like I matter for who I am, not what I can do for someone else or what family I come from. You see me, really see me, and you still choose to be here. I love you more than I knew it was possible to love someone. Is that a yes?" Xavier asked, hardly daring to hope. "Yes," Laura said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you. I want nothing more than to be your wife." Xavier swept her into his arms, spinning her around before setting her down gently and kissing her with all the love and promise he felt. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were grinning like fools. "We should tell my family," Xavier said. "They'll be thrilled." "There's something we need to do first," Laura said, her expression growing serious. "Xavier, I cannot marry you while living in fear. I cannot start our life together always looking over my shoulder, waiting for my uncle to find me. We need to find a way to resolve this." "What are you thinking?" Xavier asked. "I need to go to the authorities in Denver," Laura said. I need to tell them what I saw, what my uncle did. Even if they don't believe me, at least there will be a record. At least I will have tried to do the right thing." "That's dangerous," Xavier said. "If your uncle has as many connections as you say, going back to Denver could get you killed." "I know," Laura said. "But I cannot live like this anymore, and I won't start our marriage by asking you to hide me forever. I need to face this." Xavier was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we'll face it together, but we're going to do this smart. We'll get evidence, we'll make a plan, and we'll make sure you're protected every step of the way." Over the next 2 weeks, they prepared carefully. Xavier made discreet inquiries and learned that his uncle's business partner, a man named William Thorne, had indeed disappeared under mysterious circumstances. There were rumors but no proof, and Richard Kensington had taken over Thorne's mining interests without any legal challenge. "We need someone who knew Thorne, who can testify about his business dealings with your uncle," Xavier said as they pored over the information they had gathered. "Someone who might be willing to question the official story." "His wife," Laura said suddenly. "Margaret Thorne. She and I were acquaintances. If she had any suspicions about her husband's death, she might be willing to listen." It was decided that Laura and Xavier would travel to Trinidad, a town in southern Colorado, where Mrs. Thorne had reportedly gone to live with her sister after her husband's death. It was far enough from Denver to be safer, but still within reach of the territorial authorities. James Irving insisted on coming with them, and Thomas as well. "You're not facing this alone," James said firmly. "We're family now, or as good as. We protect our own." The journey to Trinidad took several days. Laura was nervous but determined, and having Xavier beside her made her feel like perhaps she could actually do this. They arrived in Trinidad on a gray afternoon in late March, the town bustling with activity as miners and ranchers conducted their business. They found Mrs. Thorne living in a modest house on the edge of town. She was a woman in her 40s with sad eyes and a weary bearing. When Laura introduced herself, recognition and surprise flickered across Margaret Thorne's face. "Laura Kensington, I heard you had gone missing. Your uncle said you had run off with some drifter." "That's not true," Laura said. "Mrs. Thorne, may we come in? I have something very important to tell you." Inside the small parlor, Laura told her story again, this time with all the details. She described what she had seen through the study window, how her uncle had realized she was there, how she had fled in terror for her life. Margaret Thorne listened with growing horror, her hands clenched in her lap. "I knew," she whispered when Laura finished. "I knew something wasn't right about William's death. He was afraid those last few weeks, looking over his shoulder. He told me he had discovered some discrepancies in the mining company accounts, that your uncle had been embezzling from their partnership. He was going to confront him, and then he was just gone." Tears streamed down her face, but I had no proof, nothing but a feeling. "Everyone said it was an accident, that he had fallen in the mountains." "Help me bring him to justice," Laura said, taking the older woman's hands. "Help me make sure your husband didn't die for nothing." Margaret Thorne nodded, her expression hardening with determination. "Tell me what you need me to do." With Margaret's testimony and Laura's eyewitness account, they went to the territorial marshal in Trinidad, a man named James Donovan who had a reputation for honesty. Marshal Donovan listened carefully to their story, asked detailed questions, and finally agreed to investigate. "Richard Kensington is a powerful man," he warned them. "This isn't going to be easy, and it could take time. Miss Kensington, you'll need to stay somewhere safe while we build the case." "She'll be staying with us at our ranch north of here," James Irving said firmly, "and she'll be under our protection." Marshal Donovan nodded. "I'll send word when we need her testimony. In the meantime, stay alert. If Kensington gets wind of this investigation, he may make a move. They returned to the ranch with a mixture of relief and anxiety. Laura had taken the first step toward freedom, but they all knew the danger wasn't over. Xavier was more protective than ever, and Laura caught him several times standing at the window at night, watching the darkness as if expecting trouble. "We're going to get through this," she told him one evening, wrapping her arms around him from behind. "We're going to have our life together, Xavier. I believe that now." He turned in her embrace, pulling her close. "I love you," he said simply. "Whatever happens, I want you to know that loving you has been the best thing in my life." "Then marry me now," Laura said impulsively. "Don't wait for the case to be resolved or for things to be perfect. Marry me now and we'll face whatever comes as husband and wife." Xavier stared at her for a moment, then a slow smile spread across his face. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything," Laura said. They were married 3 days later in the small church in Trinidad, with Xavier's family and Mrs. Thorne as witnesses. Laura wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her make, and Xavier wore his best suit. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier kissed her with such tenderness and joy that Laura felt like she might burst from happiness. That night, in the small room at the boarding house where they spent their wedding night before returning to the ranch, Xavier held her close and whispered promises against her skin. He promised to love her always, to protect her, to build a life with her that would be filled with joy and purpose. And Laura, feeling safer and more cherished than she ever had in her life, promised the same. The weeks that followed were among the happiest Laura had ever known, despite the shadow that still hung over them. She was Xavier's wife now, and that simple fact filled her with a contentment she hadn't known was possible. They talked about building their own house on the ranch property, about the children they hoped to have someday, about growing old together watching the mountains change with the seasons. 2 months after their wedding, Marshal Donovan sent word. They had gathered enough evidence to bring charges against Richard Kensington. With Laura and Margaret's testimonies, along with evidence of embezzlement that William Thorne had hidden before his death, they had a case. Laura would need to come to Denver to testify before the territorial judge. "I'll be with you every step of the way," Xavier said as they prepared for the journey. "You're not facing him alone." The trial took place in June of 1879 in the federal courthouse in Denver. Laura sat in the witness box and told her story to a courtroom full of people, never wavering even when her uncle's lawyer tried to discredit her. She looked at Richard Kensington, at the man who had wanted her dead, and felt no fear anymore. She had Xavier beside her, his steady presence giving her strength. She had found her voice and she used it. Margaret Thorne testified about her husband's fears and the documents he had hidden. A federal accountant testified about the embezzlement. The evidence was damning, and when the judge finally rendered his verdict, Richard Kensington was found guilty of murder and theft. He was sentenced to hang. As they left the courthouse, Laura felt like a weight she had been carrying for over a year had finally lifted. She was free, truly free. Her uncle could never hurt her again. "How do you feel?" Xavier asked as they stood on the courthouse steps, the Denver sunshine bright overhead. "Like I can breathe for the first time in a year," Laura said. She turned to him, taking both his hands in hers. "Like I can finally start living instead of just surviving. Xavier, let's go home." They returned to the ranch in southern Colorado, to the life they were building together. True to their plans, they built a small house on the ranch property, not far from the main house but separate enough to be their own. It was modest but beautiful, with a porch that looked out over the mountains and a bedroom window that framed the stars at night. Laura threw herself into ranch life with enthusiasm. She learned to ride properly, helped with the cattle during branding season, and kept chickens that provided eggs for both their house and the main house. She planted a garden and learned to can and preserve food for the winter. The work was hard, but it was honest and satisfying in a way that her old life in Denver had never been. In the spring of 1880, Laura discovered she was pregnant. She and Xavier were overjoyed, though Xavier became even more protective than before, insisting she rest more and not work too hard. Their son was born in December of that year, a healthy baby boy with Xavier's dark hair and Laura's eyes. They named him James, after Xavier's father, and the whole ranch celebrated his arrival. Holding her son in her arms, looking at Xavier's face full of love and wonder as he gazed at their child, Laura thought about how far she had come. 2 years ago, she had been running for her life, alone and terrified with nowhere to go and no one to trust. Now she had a home, a family, and a love that filled her entire being. "What are you thinking about?" Xavier asked, settling beside her on the bed and gently touching their son's tiny hand. "I'm thinking about how you saved me," Laura said. "Not just from the wilderness or from my uncle, but from a life where I never would have known what real love feels like. You became my home, Xavier, my safety, my everything." Xavier leaned over to kiss her forehead, then their son's. "You saved me too," he said. "I was just going through the motions before you came into my life. You gave me purpose, gave me something to fight for. You're my heart, Laura." Little James made a small sound and they both laughed, the moment perfect in its simplicity. Outside, the Colorado winter was setting in, but inside their home there was warmth and love and the promise of a future they would build together. As the years passed, their family grew. A daughter named Sarah came 2 years after James, with Laura's dark hair and Xavier's steadiness. Then another son, William, named for Margaret Thorne's late husband, who had inadvertently set Laura on the path that led to her new life. The children grew up on the ranch, learning to ride and work the land, surrounded by the love of their parents and the extended Irving family. Laura maintained her friendship with Margaret Thorne, who eventually moved closer to Trinidad and remarried a kind shopkeeper. The two women often visited, their friendship forged in shared tragedy but sustained by genuine affection. Laura also worked with the church in Trinidad to help other women who found themselves in desperate situations, using her own experience to offer hope and practical assistance. Xavier's ranch continued to prosper, and as his father grew older, he and his brothers took on more of the responsibility. Xavier proved to be a natural leader, fair with the ranch hands and shrewd in business. But he never let work consume him, always making time for Laura and their children, understanding that family was the foundation everything else was built on. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier took Laura back to the high meadow where he had proposed, leaving the children with Mrs. Patterson for the afternoon. The meadow was full of wildflowers, just as it had been that spring day so long ago. "You ever regret it?" Laura asked as they stood looking out over the valley. Marrying a woman with so much trouble following her, Xavier pulled her into his arms, his expression incredulous. "Regret? Laura, loving you and building this life with you has been the greatest adventure of my life. Every single day with you is a gift. Even when I burned dinner last week," Laura teased. "Especially then," Xavier said with a grin. "Watching you try to scrape that stew off the bottom of the pot while cursing in a very unladylike manner was quite entertaining." Laura laughed, swatting his arm playfully. Then she grew serious, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "I love you, Xavier Irving. You gave me a life I never dreamed I could have. You showed me what it means to be truly loved and truly safe." "And you showed me what it means to be brave," Xavier said. To face your fears and fight for what matters. You're the strongest person I know, Laura." They stood there in the meadow, holding each other as the sun moved across the sky. Two people who had found in each other everything they had been looking for. Laura thought about the terrified girl she had been, running through the wilderness with blood on her hands, and marveled at the transformation that love had wrought. She had found not just safety and shelter, but a home in every sense of the word. A place where she belonged, where she was cherished, where she could be fully herself. That evening they returned to their house where their children were waiting, James now a serious boy of 9, Sarah a spirited 7-year-old, and William a mischievous 4-year-old. The family gathered around the dinner table, sharing stories of their day, and Laura looked around at these faces she loved so much and felt her heart swell with gratitude. After the children were in bed, Laura and Xavier sat on their porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. This was their ritual, this quiet time together at the end of each day, and Laura treasured it. "I never get tired of this view," Xavier said, his arm around Laura's shoulders. "Neither do I," Laura agreed, though she was looking at him rather than the mountains. Xavier caught her gaze and smiled, that slow, warm smile that still made her heart skip a beat after all these years. He leaned down to kiss her, gentle and sweet, a promise renewed with every touch. "Come to bed," he murmured against her lips. "We have another full day tomorrow." "In a minute," Laura said. "I just want to sit here a little longer and count my blessings." Xavier settled back beside her, content to wait. And Laura did count them, each blessing clear and bright as the stars overhead. A husband who loved her deeply and truly. Children who were healthy and happy. A home that was built on love and trust. A life that had meaning and purpose. She thought about how close she had come to losing everything, to dying alone in the wilderness or at her uncle's hands. But fate, or providence, or simple chance had put Xavier Irving in her path that day by Miller's Creek. He had chosen to help a desperate stranger, and in doing so had changed both their lives forever. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" Xavier asked, pulling her closer against the evening chill. "I'm thinking about that day you found me," Laura said. "What would have happened if you had ridden a different path that morning, if your horse hadn't sensed me behind that log?" "But I didn't ride a different path," Xavier said firmly. "I found you and you found me, and everything else followed from that. You can spend your whole life wondering about what might have been, or you can be grateful for what is." "I am grateful," Laura said, "more than I can ever express." "Then show me," Xavier said with a teasing glint in his eyes. "Come inside with your husband and show me." Laura laughed, allowing him to pull her to her feet. Hand in hand, they walked into their house, into the life they had built together from courage and kindness and love. The years continued to unfold in a pattern of seasons and celebrations, challenges and triumphs. James grew into a young man who was as steady and honorable as his father, taking naturally to ranch work. Sarah proved to have her mother's quick mind and her father's love of the land, and often said she never wanted to leave the ranch. William was the wild one, always getting into scrapes but with a heart of gold that made it impossible to stay angry with him for long. Xavier's father passed away peacefully in his sleep when James was 15, and the ranch was divided between Xavier and his brothers. Xavier's portion included the house he and Laura had built and a substantial grazing area for their cattle. They continued to work closely with Thomas and Robert, the three brothers maintaining the family unity that their father had valued so highly. Laura's hair began to show silver threads as she moved through her 30s, and Xavier developed the weathered look of a man who had spent his life outdoors. But their love never weathered, never faded. If anything, it deepened with time. each shared experience adding another layer of connection between them. When James was 18 and began courting a sweet girl from Trinidad, Laura watched her son with his sweetheart and remembered her own courtship with Xavier. She saw the same tenderness in James's eyes that she had seen in Xavier's, and knew that she and Xavier had given their children the most important gift of all. They had shown them what real love looked like. Sarah, at 16, announced that she wanted to be a teacher, and Laura and Xavier supported her ambitions, arranging for her to attend a teaching college in Denver. It was hard to let their daughter go, even temporarily, but they were proud of her determination and intelligence. William, at 13, was still figuring out his path, but he showed a remarkable talent with horses that suggested he might become a horse trainer. One evening, as Laura and Xavier celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their grown children and extended family, Laura stood and raised her glass to make a toast. 20 years ago, she said, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd, I was lost and alone with nowhere to go and no one to trust. I thought my life was over. But then a cowboy on a paint horse found me by a creek and decided to help, even though he didn't know me and had no reason to get involved in my troubles. She looked at Xavier, her eyes shining with love. That cowboy became my home and my safety. He became my everything. Xavier Irving, you are the best man I have ever known, and spending these 20 years as your wife has been the greatest honor of my life. Here's to 20 more and 20 after that, and however many years God grants us together. Xavier stood and came to her side, wrapping his arms around her waist. Laura, you took my ordinary life and made it extraordinary. You brought light and love and purpose into every day. You gave me 3 beautiful children and a partnership that makes every challenge bearable and every joy doubled. I love you more today than I did 20 years ago, and I'll love you even more tomorrow. You're my heart, my home, my everything. They kissed to the applause and cheers of their family and friends, and Laura felt the same flutter in her stomach that she had felt the first time Xavier kissed her all those years ago in Mrs. Patterson's room. Later, when the party had wound down and they were alone in their bedroom, Xavier helped Laura out of her dress, his touches reverent and familiar. They had made love countless times over their 20 years of marriage, but it never lost its power, never became routine. Each time was a renewal of their commitment, a celebration of the connection they shared. Afterward, lying in Xavier's arms, Laura traced patterns on his chest and thought about the fullness of her life. She had everything she had ever dreamed of and so much more. She had found her purpose in being Xavier's wife, in raising their children, in helping other women find their own paths to safety and freedom. She had found her voice and used it to make a difference. Happy, Xavier murmured, his hand stroking her hair. Deliriously, Laura said. Are you? Always with you, Xavier said. They drifted off to sleep tangled together as they had every night for 20 years, 2 people who had found in each other a safe harbor in life's storms. The years continued their steady march. James married his sweetheart and built a house on the ranch property, staying close to continue the family business. Sarah finished her teaching college and returned to Trinidad to teach at the local school, marrying a doctor she met at church. William, as predicted, became a renowned horse trainer, traveling throughout Colorado and beyond to work with difficult horses. Xavier and Laura became grandparents and found joy in the new role. They were the ones who spoiled the grandchildren, who told them stories and taught them to ride and passed down the family traditions. Laura watched her grandchildren play in the same meadows where her own children had played, and marveled at the legacy she and Xavier had created together. When they celebrated their 30th anniversary, It was a quieter affair, just family gathered for dinner. Laura's hair was fully silver now, and Xavier's face was deeply lined, but they still held hands under the table like young lovers. Their children gave speeches about the example their parents had set, about the love and stability that had shaped their own lives. "I never knew my own mother and father to show affection the way you two do," James said. "You taught me that marriage should be a partnership built on love and respect, not just duty or convenience. You gave me a model to follow in my own marriage, and I'm grateful for that every day." Sarah added, "You taught me that women can be strong and brave, that we don't have to accept the limitations society tries to place on us. Mother, watching you rebuild your life after everything you went through showed me that we can overcome anything if we have courage and people who believe in us." Even William, who was not given to sentimentality, spoke about how his parents' example had shaped him. "You taught me that love is not just a feeling, it's a choice you make every day. I've seen you two face hard times and good times, and you always chose each other first. That's what I want in my own life someday." Laura was crying by the time her children finished speaking, and Xavier's eyes were suspiciously bright. They had built something real and lasting, something that would continue long after they were gone. Their love had created a legacy of family and commitment that would echo through generations. As they grew older, Laura and Xavier slowly handed over more of the ranch operations to James, though Xavier still spent every day outdoors, insisting that he was not too old to check fence lines or help with the cattle. Laura continued to work with women in need, her own experiences giving her insight and empathy that made her invaluable to those seeking help. On their 40th anniversary, they went back to the high meadow one more time. It was harder to make the ride now, their bodies no longer as strong or flexible as they once were, but they managed it with James's help. He left them alone there, promising to return in a few hours. 40 years, Laura said, standing in the same spot where Xavier had proposed so long ago. "It feels like a lifetime and like no time at all." "I know what you mean," Xavier said, standing beside her. "I can still see you as you were that day I found you by the creek, so young and scared and brave. But I love the woman you are now even more than I loved the girl you were then." "We've had a good life, haven't we?" Laura asked, leaning against his side. "The best," Xavier confirmed. "No regrets, Laura, not a single one." They stood together in the meadow, watching the mountains in comfortable silence. Two souls so intertwined after 40 years that it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. When James came back to collect them, he found his parents sitting in the grass, holding hands, Laura's head on Xavier's shoulder. "You two ready to head back?" he asked. "Ready," Xavier said, standing and helping Laura to her feet. They moved more slowly now, but they moved together, always together. Back at the house, surrounded by children and grandchildren, Laura reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about that terrified 19-year-old girl running through the wilderness, and wished she could tell her that everything would be all right. That she would find safety and love, that she would build a beautiful life, that the darkness she was running from would eventually be left far behind. But then again, maybe that girl would not have believed it. Maybe she needed to walk the path herself, needed to find Xavier and fall in love and build this life one day at a time. Maybe the journey was as important as the destination. "What are you thinking about?" Xavier asked, coming to sit beside her on the porch after everyone had left. "I'm thinking about how grateful I am," Laura said. "For every moment, every memory, every day we've had together. You gave me a life, Xavier, a real life full of love and purpose. You gave me a home when I had nowhere to go and safety when I had no one to trust. You gave me yourself freely and completely, and that has made all the difference." Xavier took her hand, his grip still strong despite the years. "And you gave me the same, Laura. You made me a better man, a happier man. You filled my life with meaning and joy. Whatever time we have left, however long or short, I want to spend every moment of it with you." "Always," Laura agreed. "Always together." They sat on the porch as the sun set, two elderly people who had loved each other through 40 years of joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge. The cowboy and the woman he had found in the wilderness, bound together by a love that had proven stronger than fear, stronger than danger, stronger than anything the world had thrown at them. Xavier and Laura lived to see their 50th anniversary, a milestone celebrated by the entire town of Trinidad. They had become something of a legend in the area, the story of how they met and fell in love told and retold, until it had taken on the quality of a fairy tale. But those who knew them best knew that the real story was even better than the legend, because it was true in all the ways that mattered. On the morning of their 50th anniversary, Laura woke in Xavier's arms, just as she had for 50 years. His hair was white now, and his face was deeply carved with wrinkles, but his eyes still held the same warmth and love they had held when he was a young man of 24. She touched his face gently, and he stirred, smiling at her. "Good morning, my love," he said, his voice rougher with age but still tender. "Good morning," Laura replied. 50 years, Xavier. Can you believe it? Sometimes it feels like 500 years, and sometimes it feels like we just got married yesterday," Xavier said, pulling her closer. "But every single one of those years has been worth it." They spent the day surrounded by their family. All 3 of their children were there, along with their spouses and their children, and even some great-grandchildren. The house overflowed with love and laughter, with stories and memories, with the tangible evidence of a life well lived. That evening, when everyone had gone and they were alone again, Xavier and Laura walked slowly to their favorite spot on the porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple, and the mountains stood eternal in the distance. "You remember what I said to you the day we got married?" Xavier asked, his arm around Laura's shoulders. "You said a lot of things that day," Laura teased gently. "I promised you that I would love you always, that I would protect you, that I would build a life with you filled with joy and purpose," Xavier said. "And I meant every word. Laura, I have loved you every single day of our marriage. I love you now, and I will love you for whatever time we have left and beyond." "And I love you," Laura said, tears running down her weathered cheeks. "You were my miracle, Xavier. You saved me in every way a person can be saved. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You gave me love. Everything good in my life came from the moment you decided to help a desperate stranger by Miller's Creek." "You saved me too," Xavier insisted. "You gave my life meaning, Laura. Before you, I was just existing. After you, I was truly living." They sat together until full dark, until the stars emerged bright and clear in the Colorado sky. When the evening grew cold, they went inside, Xavier helping Laura up the steps they had climbed together for decades. They prepared for bed with the comfortable routine of 50 years of marriage, and when they lay down, Xavier pulled Laura into his arms. "I'm tired," Laura admitted. "More tired than I've ever been." "Then rest," Xavier said, kissing her forehead. "I'm here, I'll always be here." Laura closed her eyes, feeling safe and loved and complete. She had lived a full life, a beautiful life, far beyond anything she could have imagined that night she fled from Denver in terror. She had known love in its truest form, had raised children and seen grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She had made a difference in the world, had helped others find their own paths to safety. She had no regrets, no wishes for things to be different. "Thank you," she whispered to Xavier, her voice already fading into sleep. "Thank you for everything." "Thank you," Xavier whispered back, holding her close. "Sleep now, my love." And Laura slept, deeply and peacefully, in the arms of the man who had been her home and her safety for 50 years, surrounded by the life they had built together in the wild beauty of Colorado, content in every possible way that a human heart can be content.